Today is MLK Day. On this day, we reflect on the life and legacy of American icon, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Some might take this time to reflect on Dr. King's attitudes towards protest, in which he was nonviolent. Others might look to his ideals for how America should be, which is the land of liberty and justice for all. Oftentimes on MLK Day, I see people sharing the I Have a Dream speech. And while this is a legendary speech by Dr. King and it's wonderful, Dr. King was more than just that. He made plenty of other speeches. And today I'll be highlighting another speech that he gave in 1967, which was after the I Have a Dream speech, called The Other America. Here I'll be sharing some clips from that speech and elaborating on Dr. King's talking points a bit further.
In the final analysis, racism is evil because its ultimate logic is genocide. If one says that I am not good enough to live next door to him, if one says that I am not good enough to eat at a lunch counter, or to have a good decent job, or to go to school with him, merely because of my race, he is saying consciously or unconsciously that I do not deserve to exist.
Dr. King makes a good point here that racism can lead to genocide. When we look at blacks in the US specifically, we can see how systemic racism has led to blacks being harmed in many ways. We can look at the healthcare industry, and we can look at the school to prison pipeline. These are just examples. Now, the school to prison pipeline is pretty much this idea, well, we've seen it in reality. So we'll just say this condition in which many black individuals are not properly cared for in the school system. This happens from kindergarten all the way up to college, to be honest. We see many schools that have predominantly black individuals not having the proper resources, not having good books. And a result of that, for some individuals, this could lead to a life of poor decision making, not being properly educated, and eventually prison. We can also look at racism when it comes down to law enforcement. And oddly enough, people were sharing a quote from The Other America last year during the many protests in favor of Black lives. The quote goes, "A riot is the language of the unheard," in which MLK said during this speech. And we saw last year that several black individuals were killed by cops unjustly, and people rioted as a result. We had many protests that were going on across the United States and beyond. But let me circle back. I want to focus specifically on media here when it comes down to police brutality against black individuals or law enforcement's treatment of blacks. I've personally seen media depict blacks in several instances as savages or animals or ruthless. And for this very reason, I actually personally don't like when black people call themselves a savage or refer to themselves as savages. But let's think about how this attitude or this stereotype or this depiction of black individuals seeps into the minds of different people in the US. So you have to think about how these images trickle down into society and how police and law enforcement, who are citizens in the United States, might interpret these images, saying that, okay, blacks are savages, they are beasts. So whenever they encounter a black individual, that encounter might turn fatal. There's actually a study that shows that black men are perceived as being bigger than they actually are, even when compared to a white individual. Did you know that blacks are 2 to 3 times likelier to be killed by the cops than white people? So you can't tell me that race isn't a factor in these cop killings or how law enforcement treats blacks. It is racism. And I have to say, you have racist cops too, so yes, that's a thing. But on to the next clip.
Man was on the plane with me some weeks ago, and he came and talked with me, and he said, the problem, Dr. King, that I see with what you all are doing is that every time I see you and other Negroes, you are protesting, and you aren't doing anything for yourselves. And he went on to tell me that he was very poor at one time, and he was able to make it by doing something for himself. Why don't you teach your people, he said, to lift themselves by their own bootstraps? And then he went on to say other groups face disadvantages, the Irish, the Italians, and he went down the line. And I said to him that it does not help the Negro, it only deepens his frustration for unfeeling and sensitive people to say to him that other ethnic groups who migrated or were immigrants to this country just 100 years ago or so have gotten beyond him, and he came here some 344 years ago. And I went on to remind him that the Negro came to this country involuntarily in chains, while others came voluntarily. I went on to remind him that no other racial group has been a slave on American soil. I went on to remind him that the other problem that we have faced over the years is that the society placed a stigma on the color of the Negro, on the color of his skin, because he was black. Doors were closed to him that were not closed to other groups.
Personally speaking, I've had people from immigrant backgrounds and white individuals tell me, well, my family struggled, but we were able to succeed. Why can't your family, why can't blacks do the same thing? And once again, I have to go back to systemic racism. Now, when you think about the history of slavery, Jim Crow, how blacks are constantly being oppressed, it's hard to succeed. Let's take employment, for example. Did you know that having a black sounding name can make it less likely for a black individual to be hired? So if you have a name like Laquan or Shaquita, an employer might think, oh, I don't want to hire this individual. Clip number 3.
And it has failed to hear that large segments of white society are more concerned about tranquility and the status quo than about justice, equality, and humanity.
Personal experience, I've seen many white individuals, they're okay with things being the way they are, just as long as it doesn't bother them. So it's kind of like an out of sight, out of mind thing. Blacks are being persecuted against, they're struggling, but it's not affecting me, it's not affecting my dollars, so I don't care. I guess part of it's just human nature, and another part of it is specifically white privilege, because you enjoy the luxuries of the US and other people are struggling, but it doesn't bother you. With that being said, I have to let you know that blacks were integral to the creation of this country. You look at the American slave trade, you look at how the US has profited greatly off of the cotton industry. Most of the money your family has as a white individual and most of the privileges that you enjoy is because of Negroes. So this out of sight, out of mind attitude has to stop. And I hope you know that it eventually can come into your backyard. Let's look at this scenario, for example. You have a black individual that is poor and struggling due to systemic racism. They might think, oh, well, I need to rob somebody in order to make money to buy food for my family. They go into an affluent white neighborhood, they rob the white person, and voila. So yeah, an injustice somewhere is a threat to justice everywhere, or what Dr. King said. The quote should be somewhere. All right, last clip.
And I've heard this over and over again. There are those, and they're often sincere people, who say to Negroes and their allies in the white community that we should slow up and just be nice and patient and continue to pray, and in 100 or 200 years the problem will work itself out, because only time can solve the problem. I think that is an answer to that myth. And it is that time is neutral. It can be used either constructively or destructively. And I'm absolutely convinced that the forces of ill will in our nation, the extreme righteous in our nation, have often used time much more effectively than the forces of goodwill. Somewhere we must come to see that social progress never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts and the persistent work of dedicated individuals, and without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the primitive forces of social stagnation.
Oftentimes I hear people say we have a long way to go when it comes to racism, but the time is now to deal with it. You look at this speech from Dr. King, this is back in 1967, he's talking about the same issues that we're still dealing with today. Are we gonna just forever be in this endless cycle, this 360, this timeless loop, or are we really going to progress in a positive direction? So my charge to you all on this MLK Day is to truly move forward, not just hear Dr. King's words, but actually put them into action. And I mean tangible action. So if you're an employer and you have a resume come your way and you have a black sounding name like Shaquita or Laquan, if they are fit for the job, don't discriminate against them, hire them. And for white individuals and non-black individuals, to be honest, I would do your research. Find out more about the black struggle in the United States. Like, educate yourself. Don't depend on black people to educate you. You can also donate to black organizations, but make sure these black organizations are actually doing the work. There are other things you can do to help black people in the United States and help them get over the hump, like supporting reparations, maybe? But that's for you to figure out. I'm not here to give you all the answers. I might write an article on that later, but that's not for this video. With that being said, happy MLK Day, everyone out there, and I ask that you please do your part to help black people succeed in this country. Thank you.
Chemistry Productions.